Watchmen is a 12-issue comic book series by Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons. To this day, Watchmen is considered one of the most influential graphic novels of all time. It was included on Time magazine's 100 Best Novels of the 20th Century, and was also the first comic book ever to win a Hugo Award. Watchmen was released in 1985, when comic books were still considered a shallow pastime for kids. It was an extremely adult series that dealt with a lot of mature subjects, like the Cold War, the threat of nuclear war, and basic human ethics. It helped the general public take comic books more seriously, and showed that they could be considered a serious form of high art. It was the first comic book ever to put superheroes in the real world. It takes place in an alternate version of our own history, where superheroes have existed since the 1940s. But in the late 70s, superheroes were outlawed by the Keene Act, and ever since then, most of the superheroes have either retired, gone into hiding, or started working for the government. But when somebody kills the comedian, one of the OG superheroes, they're called back into action to figure out who's trying to have them killed. There's a hell of a lot more going on, but that's the basic gist of it. All of the characters represent some sort of superhero archetype. Night Owl is a gadget-slinging crime fighter like Batman. Dr. Manhattan is an all-powerful deity with supernatural powers like Superman. Silk Spectre is an ass-kicking female like Wonder Woman. When they were writing Watchmen, Alan Moore and Dave Gibbons used techniques that had never been done before. This included coming up with comic books within comic books, using the way the panels were laid out to tell the story, putting extra background information between each chapter, using an inverted color scheme, and using past, present, and future perspective to tell the story. Watchmen is also a movie directed by Zack Snyder, which is not high art, unless he happened to smoke a giant fatty beforehand. The Watchmen movie has been compared to Passion of the Christ, simply because of how polarizing it is even among comic book fans. Some people love the movie, while some people hate the movie. The movie copies the graphic novel almost exactly, which is either a great idea or a terrible idea, depending on who you ask. So today I'm going to be reviewing the movie and what it did right and what it did wrong. I'm going to be talking about Zack Snyder, all the cast members, and some of the problems they face trying to adapt it to the big screen. And since I'm a director and screenwriter myself, I'm going to be doing all of this from a filmmaker's perspective. And for the record, I'm only going to be talking about the theatrical cut of the movie. I can acknowledge that Tales of the Black Freighter exists, but there's probably like 50 different cuts of the movie out there somewhere, and if we try to talk about all of them, we're going to be here all night. When I read Watchmen for the first time, it literally changed my life. It sounds like an exaggeration, but it's actually true. I had never read a story like this before in my entire life. As an aspiring writer, it completely changed my perception of how you could tell a story and what kind of an impact you could have on the reader. Watchmen didn't just rewrite the rule book, it threw it in the garbage, set it on fire, and rewrote it from scratch, all in the course of 12 chapters. I will never forget how much Ozymandias' plan to create world peace blew my mind when I read it for the first time. So what do I like about Watchmen? Well, I love Watchmen for all the other reasons everybody else loves Watchmen. It questions our sensibilities of what's truly right and what's truly wrong. Rorschach is a character who sees everything in black and white, just like his mask. There are good people and there are evil people, and evil must be punished. But at the same time, Rorschach is using extremely violent and brutal methods to punish criminals. He's a mentally ill person who's taken the law into his own hands. He wants to do the right thing, but nothing he does is ever truly heroic. If anything, it goes to show that there's nothing admirable about grown men running around in spandex punching bad guys. This basically sums up the entire story. Up until 1985, comic books were very black and white. You had the good guy and you had the bad guy. But the world doesn't work that way. Every day we're constantly being faced with moral dilemmas, which is something the book encapsulates perfectly. None of the characters are ever truly right and none of them are ever truly wrong. This leads to one of the most screwed up endings I can possibly imagine. But more than anything else, what I like about the book is its use of perspective. Watchmen doesn't have a main character. Instead, each chapter focuses on one character at a time. The first two chapters focus on the comedian, then we focus on Dr. Manhattan, then we focus on Rorschach, and then we focus on Dan and Laurie, and then we focus on Adrian Veidt, aka Ozymandias. However, the story is being told from Dr. Manhattan's perspective and how he views time. There is no future, there is no past. Do you see? Time is simultaneous, an intricately structured jewel that humans insist on viewing one edge at a time when the whole design is visible in every facet. This is where the panels of a comic book come in handy. One panel might focus on something in the present, then the next panel might focus on something in the past, then the next panel might focus on something totally different, like another character or some weird comic book about pirates or something. The panels are constantly jumping back and forth from one character and one perspective to the next. The past, present, and future are all happening at the same time. Again, just like how Dr. Manhattan views time. Normally, writing your story this way would be a total clusterfuck. But the reason it works in Watchmen is because every chapter has an overarching theme. Even though we're cutting back and forth from one character and one perspective to the next, there's still some sort of general idea holding it all together. At the end of every chapter, there might be a quote or a song lyric or something a character says that ties it all up in a neat little bow at the end. This type of structure also represents how people read comic books. The nice thing about comic books is that you don't have to read them in chronological order. You can go back to an earlier page and read about what happened in the past. Then you can go back to the present, and then you can keep reading into the future. The reason this is so impressive is because this is the type of thing that would only work in a comic book setting. You could never do anything like this in a movie or in any other kind of novel. And what's even more impressive is how time itself feeds into the story. The title of the book, Watchmen, is not talking about any group of superheroes. There is no superhero team called the Watchmen. This is a really common misconception about the story and something even the movie gets wrong. Instead, Watchmen represents the major theme of the book, which is the passage of time itself. Images of clocks and watchmakers are constantly showing up, whether it's the Doomsday Clock or the fact that the graphic novel only has 12 chapters. Throughout the story, time is repeating itself constantly. There's parallels between things that happen in the past and things that are happening in the present. Characters will repeat many of the same lines of dialogue, and many of the same images will pop up as the story progresses. In other words, the amount of time and effort and creativity that went into writing something like this is absolutely mind-boggling to me. But this is also the reason Watchmen was considered quote-unquote unfilmable for so many years. If you tried to edit something like this into a movie, your audience would end up frightened and confused and have no idea what's going on. Imagine if you were watching a movie and all of a sudden it cut back to something that happened years ago, and then it cut to some sort of weird comic book about pirates, and then it cut back to a whole nother character in a whole nother time period somewhere. Your average movie-going audience would definitely give it a bad review on Rotten Tomatoes. The Watchmen movie spent about 20 years in production hell, starting in 1987. Originally, Terry Gilliam was supposed to direct the Watchmen movie, starring Robin Williams as Rorschach, Kevin Costner as Night Owl, Jamie Lee Curtis as Silk Spectre, and Gary Busey as the comedian. You can read the script online and it's basically the worst thing I can possibly imagine, except worse. I haven't read the whole thing, so I don't know how everything plays out exactly, but these are some of my favorite lines of dialogue. Should be just overhead. We have to distract them somehow. Just barge in. While they're staring at your tits, we'll blow their balls off. Later, when Night Owl is confronting Ozymandias, what if you're wrong? Then I've been a very bad boy and you'll have to spank me. Christ, I'm doing what I have to do to save the godforsaken human race. Maybe somebody else will have enough stomach to read the full version, but not me. I have better things to do, like making YouTube videos that only 10 people are ever going to watch. Now let's talk about Zack Snyder. Ask a million people what they think about Zack Snyder and you'll get a million different answers. Nowadays, Zack Snyder is mainly known as the guy who directed the Martha scene in Batman v Superman.
Find him! Save Martha!
But back in 2006, Zack Snyder had just come out with 300, which was a huge success and showed that there was a huge market for people who wanted to see adult comic book movies on the big screen. Just like Watchmen, 300 was adapted from a well-known graphic novel and relied very heavily on CGI. This pretty much made Zack Snyder the perfect choice to direct a Watchmen movie. But what it comes down to is that Zack Snyder is only as good as whatever writer he works with. 300 was written by Frank Miller, who's considered one of the greatest comic book writers of all time, along with Alan Moore. When they were making 300, almost everything in the movie was copied straight out of the book. The movie kind of just wrote itself. Other than some minor sequences, they really didn't have to come up with anything new, simply because they didn't have to. The Dawn of the Dead remake was written by James Gunn, who's also an extremely talented writer and director. Nowadays, he's known for the Guardians of the Galaxy movies, but not the guy who made Ellen Page rape Rainn Wilson in the movie Super, which is really unfortunate. I mean, the Dawn of the Dead remake wasn't the best movie ever made, it wasn't even the best remake ever made, but it's still a pretty solid zombie movie in my opinion. The script for the Watchmen movie was written by Alex Say and David Hayter, who you probably know as the guy who played Solid Snake in the Metal Gear Solid video games. But just like 300, Watchmen was ripped straight out of the comic book. There was very little to do in the way of writing because again, the movie pretty much wrote itself. But then you have movies like Man of Steel and Batman v Superman, which were written by David S. Goyer, who's not exactly known for being a consistent writer. I mean, yeah, he did write Batman Begins, which is a great movie, but he also wrote Pet Sematary 2 and The Crow, City of Angels. Man of Steel and Batman v Superman are littered with plot holes and sloppy writing, which Zack Snyder often gets blamed for. When you're a director, you don't have to be a good writer per se. You don't have to be able to sit down and write a script and then direct a movie like Quentin Tarantino or Paul Thomas Anderson. However, even if you're not a writer, you still have to be able to tell a story. When you're a director, every decision you make has to benefit the story or the characters in some way. You have to pick costumes that are appropriate for the characters and their personalities. You have to choose lighting that matches the tone or the mood of any given scene. You have to know exactly what the characters are thinking and experiencing, so you can direct the actors on their performances. This is one area Zack Snyder really needs work in. He's not a writer and he doesn't have to be a writer, but he has a lot of trouble making decisions that benefit the story. A perfect example of this is actually in the Watchmen movie. They changed Ozymandias' costume to include nipples on it. This is a reference to Joel Schumacher's Batman movies, where Batman and Robin had nipples on their costumes, because apparently this was a great idea. But in the Watchmen movie, this undermines the whole character of Ozymandias. I know it was meant to be a joke, but it doesn't really make any sense for him. In the graphic novel, Ozymandias' costume is very clearly inspired by ancient Egypt, which is a big part of what inspires his plan to create world peace by the end of the story. Essentially, he views the end of the world the same way the ancient Egyptians did. Plus, he has a really dumb password about Ramses II, which even Night Owl is able to guess. So while it might seem like a small detail that doesn't really mean anything, Ozymandias' costume says a lot about his character and what his motivations are by the end of the story. Meanwhile, Night Owl's ship has miniguns on it for some reason. If you watch the behind-the-scenes stuff, Zack Snyder said this was his idea, so the miniguns could shoot down the water tower. And yeah, it does make for a pretty cool sequence, I guess. But why would Night Owl need miniguns on his ship in the first place? I know Night Owl's not exactly a pacifist or anything, but I just can't picture him violently murdering somebody with miniguns. Then you have the Man of Steel movie, when General Zod uses a giant doomsday weapon to terraform the Earth so he could build a new Krypton. But this doesn't make any sense either. Why wouldn't he just find some distant planet somewhere, like a planet that has no people on it, and just build a new Krypton on that world instead? I mean, yeah, I know he was pissed off at Kal-El and probably wanted revenge against him, but murdering billions of people just to make a new Krypton seems like a giant pain in the ass. It's not very convenient or efficient. Maybe Zod could have made a new Krypton and then gone out and tried to fight Kal-El. I mean, that does seem like the more logical solution, but then you wouldn't have all the cool CGI visuals of cities being destroyed and buildings falling over. Whenever Zack Snyder makes decisions for a movie, he's making decisions based more on what visually looks cool than what actually makes sense for the story. I can kind of understand why, since film is a visual medium, but film is
is a storytelling medium first and foremost, and if your story falls apart, then everything else is going to fall apart. When it comes to Zack Snyder, everyone on the internet either loves him or hates him. There's no in between. It's either one extreme or the other. But just like the world of Watchmen, I don't think it's that black and white. Some of the decisions that Zack Snyder makes are a little baffling to me. Batman v Superman is a very poorly edited movie. For the first 90 minutes of the movie or so, you could literally switch any of these scenes around and it wouldn't have any impact on the overall story whatsoever. Both Batman v Superman and Man of Steel have really ugly filters over them, which makes everything look way too dark and murky. If you take the filters away, both movies end up looking a hell of a lot better. But despite all this, I would never explicitly say that I hate Zack Snyder or that I hate the work he's done. I definitely don't like all of his movies, but I think if you're talking about hating somebody, especially a director, it takes away from the good work they have done. It's obvious that Zack Snyder is really passionate about comic books, and that shows in both Watchmen and 300. He's a slave to the source material, but only because he wants to adapt it to the best of his ability. Even though I didn't like Batman v Superman, I admired how they tried to do something new and different. It would have been so easy just to copy and paste The Dark Knight Returns and make that into a movie, but instead they tried to come up with their own unique story with their own unique take on Batman and Superman. It didn't really work for me personally, but at least they tried to do something new, instead of just copying from somebody else's material, not to name any other movies in particular. Plus, I think Zack Snyder himself is a really cool dude. He does a lot of work for charity and suicide prevention. Everyone who works with him seems to really like him and really appreciate the work he does. I like watching interviews with him because he comes across like a movie buff who just happened to become a famous director. I say this as somebody who creates content for a living. If you can't separate the art from the artist, then you might as well take all your movies, all your records, and all your books and just throw them in the garbage. Just because somebody makes something that inspires you does not mean they're a good person. Likewise, just because somebody makes something you don't like does not mean they're a bad person. There are some really awful people out there who have made some really good movies. Meanwhile, there are some really good people out there who have made some really awful movies. I know this probably goes without saying, but it's worth mentioning when you're talking about Zack Snyder because everybody on the internet seems to have a hate boner for him. But the truth is, no director is ever perfect, and making movies is extremely hard work. It's years of your life getting off your ass and trying to make something happen, while hoping and praying that other people will like the work you do. Honestly, I think Zack Snyder did a great job with the Watchmen movie. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's probably the best adaptation we're ever going to get. If you watch the behind-the-scenes stuff, Zack Snyder drew most of the storyboards himself. When the comedian burns the map of the United States, you can see Sally Jupiter on his lighter. At the beginning of the movie, you can also see a picture of Laurie at his apartment, which shows he still has feelings for them. When Ozymandias throws the comedian out of his apartment window, spoilers, the glass on the left window vibrates to show how powerful the impact is. When they were doing motion capture for Dr. Manhattan, they attached glowing blue lights to the mocap suit so that it could light everything around him. This could have been done with CGI, but it wouldn't have looked anywhere near as authentic or as detailed, especially when you have the light reflecting in the eyes of the actors. There were 200 sets built over the course of the movie, and many of them were copied straight out of the graphic novel. The typical color palette for a comic book is red, yellow, and blue, but when they were coloring Watchmen, they did the inverse of this color palette by using green, orange, and purple, which was considered unheard of at the time and even somewhat ugly. They followed the same color palette over the course of the movie, not just on the costumes, but on all the sets and the way they light certain scenes. I love the grayish color temperature and how dimly lit some of the scenes are. It gives the movie a cold, nihilistic feel. It really does feel like the end of the world is looming. There's some great music choices in the soundtrack. One of my favorite scenes is when I'm Your Boogeyman is playing while the comedian fights the protesters. I know I'm probably going to get shit for this, but I actually like the scene in the movie more than I like the scene in the graphic novel. The music adds more life and more personality to the scene than what was originally written on paper. Everyone on the internet gushes about how awesome the opening credit sequence is. But why is it so awesome exactly? Well, it's because it's telling us everything we need to know about the world of Watchmen without saying a damn word. It shows the superheroes interacting with actual historical events, with lots of really subtle details thrown into the mix. It lets the audience know we're in an alternate timeline where people like Castro and David Bowie still exist, and where things like the assassination of John F. Kennedy still took place. A lot of the things you're seeing in the opening credit sequence, like Dollar Bill's cape getting stuck in a revolving door, and the comedian shooting JFK, are things that are mentioned in the graphic novel, but things we don't explicitly see. Now they're brought to life in a way that tells us who these people are and what ended up happening to them years later. Basically, the opening credit sequence is a way of giving the audience a whole bunch of information in a really short amount of time in a really concise and entertaining way. Heck, even the title of the song, "The Times Are A-Changin'," fits into the major theme of the movie, which is the passage of time. Whoever came up with the idea for this opening credit sequence should definitely get a raise.